sky smiling at me.
On the 30th of June 1953, less than a month after her coronation, Queen Elizabeth II walked across the tarmac at London Airport.
The Queen and Prince Philip are at London Airport to bid farewell to the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, who are to journey to Rhodesia.
The Queen was there to wave her mother and sister off, but also to catch a glimpse of a very exciting new British aeroplane.
I never saw the sun shining so bright.
The de Havilland Comet represented the future. The world's very first commercial jet airliner, she was beautiful and sleek and flew high and fast and was very comfortable. The Comet was all British and was the envy of the world.
Nothing but blue sky.
Speed, reliability and comfort. These are among the Comet's greatest assets, backed by BOAC service second to none.
But within a year of the royal flight, a series of terrible crashes would ground the Comet fleet and devastate Britain's lead in the jet age.
This is the tragic scene of the Comet disaster near Calcutta. Wreckage of the aircraft smashed almost beyond recognition.
After a painstaking investigation, it was discovered that the plane's fuselage could crack under pressure with disastrous results. And behind that, there was a profound and historical problem. No two comets were precisely the same, designed as they were by engineers using slide rules and built by hand. The Comet is in some ways a morality story about British industry during the Queen's reign. On the one hand, we have brilliant engineers, real innovators, and a buccaneering, can-do spirit. On the other hand, all of that stood atop an industrial base which was essentially still Victorian. And dealing with that dilemma was one of the great challenges of the Second Elizabethan age. During her long reign, the Queen has presided over astonishing social, but also technological transformations.
It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
Queen Elizabeth II is the longest reigning British monarch. I want to reflect on the changes of her age and on the remarkable individuals who shaped the nation we have become. In this final programme, I will look at those pioneers and pace-setters who've wrestled with some fundamental challenges. What we produce, how we make it, and where we export it, and how we've managed a shift from heavy industries to exporting services, ideas, and creativity. Over the past 70 years, the story of British industry is often told as one of remorseless decline, and there is some truth in that. But it's not the whole story, because there was also an entire array of new Elizabethans who found new innovations, adaptations, fresh ways to build, and new things to sell.
Every day it's a getting closer, going faster than a roller coaster. Love like yours will surely come my way.
The Britain that the Queen inherited in 1952 could still be defined by its local industries. Sheffield steel, Cornish tin, Clyde-built ships, Welsh coal.
Queen Elizabeth II is the first reigning British monarch to go down a mine since George V in 1912. And she wants to know all there is to know about everything.
We were a nation built on industry. But much of that industry was beginning to look a little out of date. And the Queen wasn't the only stylish lady going down the mines. On the 21st of March, 1954, a glamorous woman, more used to furs and diamond chokers than boiler suits and miners' lamps, pulled on a hard hat, clambered into a cage like this, and was lowered into the warm, oily blackness of a coal mine. Her name was Nora Docker, wife of the multi-millionaire industrialist Sir Bernard Docker. Surrounded by miners, Lady Docker cut herself a brick-sized lump of coal. "I shall keep it in my china cabinet," she declared, "and treasure it always as proof that I have really been down and done my bit." As she emerged, blinking into the daylight, she was greeted by a corps of press photographers she'd tipped off herself. You might not think it, but in a strange way, Nora Docker embodied the changes that would buffer and transform British industry over the next half-century. They're largely forgotten these days, but the Dockers were the newspaper celebrities of their age. Sir Bernard was the epitome of the cigar-chomping industrialist. He was chairman of Birmingham's Small Arms, which owned the royal car makers Daimler, BSA motorbikes, and much else. Nora was a working-class girl with a seemingly insatiable appetite for luxury, extravagance, and glamour.
All Castleford was out as a gold-plated Daimler drove by. This luxurious transport brought Lady Docker to a marbles match.
Bernard was Nora's third millionaire husband. Not bad for a girl born above a butcher's shop in Derby. The newspapers absolutely loved them, and for year after year, the British public was delighted to be horrified by their antics. But Nora's antics were of increasing concern to the board of BSA as she splurged a fortune on expenses. Then, in 1951, her husband invited her to design a unique car for the Earl's Court Motor Show.
Nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you try.
The gold-studded, gold-plated Daimler, built for none other than the very well-known Lady Docker. There are 7,000 gold stars on it, and even the exhaust pipe is covered with gilt. Quite a car, in fact, for quite a gal, of course.
And you can get it if you try.
The car made an instant splash. In an age of post-war austerity, few people had seen excess quite like this, and suddenly the name Daimler was on everyone's lips. Well, Daimler and Docker. Every year for the next few years, Nora Docker had a new car designed for her. This is one of the last, the 1955 car known as the Golden Zebra.
I didn't know what to do the interior with, and I suddenly had the bright idea of it must be fur. Some reporter came and said, why did I do it in this particular skin? And why didn't I do it in mink? And I said, mink's too hot to sit on.
BSA should have been one of the great industrial titans of the Second Elizabethan Age, Britain's answer to Krupp in Germany or Mitsubishi in Japan. It had thrived since Victorian times, producing guns, cars, and motorbikes for world export. But by the 1950s, its old-fashioned production methods and failure to modernize saw it squeezed by cheaper foreign competitors. In this light, Lord and Lady Docker's exhibitionism seemed increasingly outrageous. And in 1956, Sir Bernard was sacked. Over time, the once great BSA was broken up. In many ways, this was a classic cautionary tale for the new Elizabethan period. Sir Bernard and Lady Docker as the greedy, profligate industrialists driving a business into the ground. But as ever, the truth is subtly and importantly different. The problems facing BSA went far deeper than any spending spree by Nora Docker. And in a curious way, she was pointing towards a different British future. Even as manufacturing was on the down, we were rediscovering the central importance of marketing flair.
Come on, everybody!
Nora Docker's celebrity perfectly highlighted both the mismanagement of our old industries and alternative futures we might embrace. But first, we had to solve a fundamental problem: how to capitalize on our spirit of invention. Summer Leighton in Suffolk, a sleepy coastal village on the edge of the Norfolk Broads. It was here that a 41-year-old engineer, idly pondering the problem of water drag on the boats he rented to tourists, hit upon an extraordinary idea. What if you could raise the boats above the water so they travelled on a cushion of air? Christopher Cockerell was one of the most remarkable men of his generation. He'd been born to notably cultured and artistic Edwardian parents, and his form of rebellion was to fling himself into electronics and engineering. By the time of the Second World War, he was one of the leading scientists working on radar. But it was in the early 1950s, pursuing that most creative of human activities, purposeful pottering, that he gave the world an entirely new form of human transport, the hovercraft. Tinkering in his workshop on a Sunday afternoon, he experimented with 2 tin cans and an air blower, seeing whether a thinner jet of air could be used to produce more pressure.
To put this thing on and bring it down, you'll see that the same amount of air produced by the blower has now produced a thrust of about 3 pounds.
The British have long had a kind of romantic love affair with the idea of the lone eccentric genius, and in many ways Cockerell was a perfect example of the type, tinkering away in his shed by himself and eventually producing something remarkable. Having established the concept, he had a boat builder friend create a model of this, the very first hovercraft. His version was in balsa wood. And then he took the idea to the British government, who proved slightly less receptive than he might have hoped.
With this, he toured the captains of British industry, but the aircraft men said, "It's not a plane, try the boat builders." And the shipyard said, "It's not a ship, try the aircraft men." Finally, he took it to the service chiefs, who said, whatever it is, it should be secret, and slapped a security cover on it that prevented its proud owner trying to sell it anywhere else.
At last, in 1958, the government finally agreed to commission a prototype, and they gave the job to Saunders Roe, a seaplane manufacturer based here on the Isle of Wight. And on the 11th of June 1959, the world's very first hovercraft, the SRN-1, swept out of this hangar and was launched on the Solent, looking for all the world like an offcut from a lost episode of Thunderbirds. 7 weeks later, the SRN-1 crossed the English Channel from Calais to Dover, with Christopher Cockerell himself on board as ballast. The age of the hovercraft had dawned. In 1965, the Queen toured the factory to see the development of this British invention. Over the next few years, Britain would build bigger and better hovercraft. By 1962, there was a regular hover service across the Solent to the Isle of Wight. And by 1968, the SRN-4 was operating a cross-channel service to France. But it was never the golden goose it could have been. The hovercraft is a glorious beast. It can do things a ship can't do, it can do things a helicopter can't do, and they operate all around the world. But they were invented here, and they ought to be a great British exporting triumph. They weren't, and for a one-word reason, government. Ministers were far too slow to invest, and then the early hovercraft manufacturers were forced to amalgamate, killing competition. And finally, Whitehall gave export licenses to foreign competitors. This had been an individual triumph and a bureaucratic failure. By 1966, just 7 years after the first flight, Christopher Cockerell had all but washed his hands of his invention. He believed British industry was being damaged by a fundamental snobbery in attitudes between the arts and the sciences. This was called the two cultures debate, passionately argued about throughout the 50s and 60s. Britain, compared to her competitors, had far fewer people at the top of the tree with a science or a maths background, far more arts and humanities people. This was, in part, pure snobbery against the dirty-fingered engineers, but it was a problem that would haunt the British economy throughout the Queen's reign. But this focus on the arts would lead us to corner the market in a very different kind of global industry.
This is BBC Television. It's 1 o'clock.
In just a few minutes, a Boeing 707 is due to arrive from New York and carrying in it 4 remarkable young men from Liverpool. And this is the moment they've been waiting for. Paul McCartney leading them off, George Harrison on the left, John Lennon at the back, Ringo Starr.
On the 22nd of February 1964, the Beatles touched down at London Airport. They'd returned from America, a global sensation. For many, it marked the beginning of what would become known as the British invasion. We tend to think of the first British invasion of US popular culture as happening in 1964, when the Beatles cracked America. But the first people to crack America weren't Lennon and McCartney, but a pair of siblings from Ealing, West London, Dion and Mary O'Brien. And if you haven't heard of them, perhaps that's because they changed their names. Dion became Tom Springfield. And Mary, well, Mary was something else.
Well, the first song was a Zulu war tune with Tom on the bongo drum, Tim on guitar, and I'm Dusty.
Dusty Springfield started her musical career with her brother as the singer in a 3-piece folk band. What do you think I should? They called themselves the Springfields because it sounded American. And in 1962, their cover of Silver Threads and Golden Needles made them the first ever British group to enter the US Billboard charts. And then, the following year, they split up. Just a month after the Springfields split up, Dusty released her first solo single, I Only Want to Be With You, and it turned her into a huge star. The song reached number 4 in the British charts, but more important commercially, it reached number 12 in the US Billboard Hot 100. Dusty Springfield now sat alongside the Beatles in spearheading the British invasion. British pop music and British fashion were now our latest export.
Baby, I feel good.
In the mid-60s, just as our heavy industries and manufacturing bases were beginning to struggle, British culture was taking off. From the Beatles to Bieber, the Mini to the mini skirt, British music, fashion and design began to generate vast sums of money for the British Exchequer. The success of that first invasion partly depended on the exploitation of a very self-conscious sense of Britishness. So, for instance, the Beatles' suits were made in Savile Row, and the Kinks sung about life in London and English nostalgia. Dusty Springfield was very different. She absorbed, almost inhaled, the sounds and the spirit of black American Motown music, and then reproduced it with an uncanny, eerie fidelity, which meant that people listening on the radio, for instance, could scarcely believe these songs were being sung by a white girl from Ealing.
I just don't know what to do with myself.
2 years after launching her solo career, Dusty would take to this stage at the London Palladium to play for the Queen at the Royal Variety Performance. More assured, more confident, and a much, much bigger star.
I just don't know what to do.
Soon after that, she went to America.
It's now my pleasure to present the talented English girl who's been turning out, oh, I say, one hit after another, and has become one of America's top singing stars. Ladies and gentlemen, the exciting Miss Dusty Springfield.
She'd go on to release a string of hits that would confirm her as a bankable star on both sides of the Atlantic. From You Don't Have to Say You Love Me to Son of a Preacher Man.
Billy Ray was a preacher's son, and when his daddy would visit, he'd come along. When they gathered around...
British culture was an increasingly valuable export. Within 50 years, the creative industries would be worth £100 billion to the UK economy.
The only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher.
And this was an important shift because by the late 1960s, some of our older industries were fading fast. Glasgow, the River Clyde.
You don't know what's going on.
For more than 100 years, this was the world's centre of shipbuilding. The term Clyde-built had been a stamp of excellence for generations.
May God bless her and all who sail in her.
These yards launched ships like the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth and the QE2. And the Queen herself had seen many of them off with obvious pride. But by the end of the 1960s, things were looking a little less rosy.
Yeah, you got
Foreign competitors had invested in modern technology and found new ways to build ships faster and cheaper, while the British shipyards were heavily unionised, labour-intensive and effectively hand-making their ships. Very high quality at a very high cost. Scottish shipbuilding, which had once been the country's most successful industry, now seemed to be in mortal danger. In June 1971, one of the largest companies, Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, or UCS, was threatened with liquidation.
It meant the possibility of thousands of men out of work in an unhopeful year, in an unhopeful place. There was a feeling that clenched like a fist.
At the height of this crisis, a UCS shop steward with Elvis Presley hair emerged as the spokesman for the workers. And he would change everything.
We're going to fight this. And we're going to fight it with a determination that Britain hasn't seen from any section of the working class this century, let alone since 1945, and we'll do it.
Jimmy Reed was one of the most compelling, charismatic and well-educated New Elizabethans of them all. A self-taught communist, he'd been brought up in extreme poverty in Govan, near the heart of Glasgow. He was determined to be a voice for the working classes and to rectify what he saw as the deep injustices of British society. And in the UCS government confrontation, he had his cause.
We're not strikers. We're responsible people. There will be no hooliganism. There will be no vandalism. There will be no bevying. Because the world is watching us, and it's our responsibility to conduct ourselves responsibly and with dignity and with maturity.
Instead of striking, Jimmy Reed persuaded the workers to carry on building ships. The yard was shut, but the men were determined to prove it was still a going concern. The UCS work-in attracted national support. Celebrities like Billy Connolly, a former shipyard worker himself, and the former Beatle John Lennon donated money to the cause. As did thousands of ordinary people up and down the country.
And on August 18th, they were out on the streets, 50,000 or more, marching to Glasgow Green in the biggest demonstration the city had seen since the war, watched and applauded by thousands more.
In February 1972, the government caved in. Having originally refused a £6 million bailout, they now pledged some £35 million to keep UCS afloat. But of course, this is not a story with a happy ending. Reed, for all his energy and his determination, was fighting world-sized changes in technology and management. Within 20 years, most of the yards around here, once so full of energy and life and noise and optimism, had fallen completely silent. Workers here were discovering what many other British workers would later learn. Simply wanting to work, turning up and working hard were no longer enough. Who was to blame? The management blamed the unions for being tribal and resistant to change. The unions blamed the managers for being arrogant, lazy and complacent. And, of course, everyone blamed the government. But with the perspective of a few more decades, it's clear they were all right. This is a story of local heroes and of catastrophic national failure. By the time of the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, our shipbuilding industry, just like our car, motorbike and bicycle industries represented by BSA, had lost their global reputations.
25 years ago, there hardly was a Japanese car industry. Now they're the biggest exporters in the world. Do you know who were the biggest exporters in 1952? We were.
But if we were becoming less good at manufacturing things, we were discovering in the 1970s that we had a distinct flair for selling. And one man would become the standard bearer for a brand new British industry.
We are the Village Green Preservation Society. God save the old duck.
This has a claim to be the most famous slope in England. For an entire generation, it was synonymous with one thing, bread. It's actually Gold Hill in Shaftesbury in Dorset, but it was universally known as Hovis Hill, and that was all down to a single TV ad made in 1973.
last stop on round would be old Marr Peggotty's place. 'Twas like taking bread to the top of the world.
The Hovis ad was a brilliant piece of marketing. It conjured up the values of a lost England of cobbled streets and thatched cottages and misty mornings and friendly neighbours. It was the work of a precocious advertising director by the name of Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott probably knows more about combining images and sounds to capture the viewer than most of the people who make the intervening programme.
I still think about it as little films, and I don't think about the marketing aspects of it, frankly. I just make the movie.
Ridley Scott grew up in the northeast of England. He came to London in the late 1950s to study graphic design at the Royal College of Art. But he became increasingly interested in film, spending his days here at the BFI South Bank, then the National Film Theatre. When he graduated, he became a set designer for the BBC. But it didn't take him long to find his way into an emerging and lucrative new industry, television advertising.
I went for the money because I discovered I could make more in a day than I could in a month at BBC. And it wasn't just for that, it was also because I was working on celluloid. I was actually turning film. And I love the process of turning film.
Ridley Scott was one of a talented and ambitious new generation who, by the 1970s, were dominating the world of advertising.
A whole new breed has appeared to serve the appetite of consumer-hunting manufacturers, the ad man. This new man has many talents, but above all, perhaps, he knows about fantasy and how to concentrate it into a 30-second bubble that might cost anything up to £1,000 a second.
In the 50s, advertising was still dominated by the mad men of New York. But by the 1960s and early 1970s, with the arrival of television advertising, a new cohort of ad men emerged. They were mostly British, and they tended to come from the grammar schools and the art colleges, not Oxford and Cambridge. They brought verve, visual imagination and youth, but something more important than all of these, a very British sense of humour.
Oh, can't you just smell those Italian wines, suffused with herbs and spices from four continents? I'm being boring. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Getting your head down, sweetie. Jolly good idea.
From the house of Cinzano, Cinzano Bianco.
Ridley Scott and his contemporaries saw advertisements as short films in their own right and brought all their creative flair to bear on a 30-second epic.
Make me a deal and make it straight.
These were carefully cast, beautifully shot, expensive products. Over in America, the television adverts were long and they were boring. And strange to say, that was because of a lack of competition. There were lots of TV channels, but they all had ad breaks at the same time. Whereas here in Britain, we had the BBC with no ads, which meant that if a viewer found an ad dull, they could simply lean over and change channels. And that, in turn, meant that Ridley Scott and his contemporaries had to transfix the viewer for at least half a minute, creating what Scott himself called 30 seconds of perfection. This collection of British advertising directors from the 1970s would go on to become some of the biggest names in Hollywood. And foremost amongst them would be Ridley Scott. From Alien to Thelma and Louise, Black Hawk Down to Gladiator. His exacting eye for detail, honed over thousands of advertisements, would turn him into one of the most in-demand feature film directors of the entire second Elizabethan age. So we still had great inventive minds, creative flair, and a knack for marketing. Our difficulty, it seemed, was making stuff. And one industry above all would show up these strengths and weaknesses. There has been no greater source of change during the Queen's reign, and I mean change in daily life, change in business, change in culture, than the computing revolution. In 1952, barely anyone had heard of computers, and these days they entirely surround us. We tend to think of this as something imported, an American thing, perhaps these days a Chinese thing. But before it was any of that, this was a British thing. And this story runs all the way from the Ferranti 1, the world's very first commercial computer, built in Manchester at the beginning of the Queen's reign, to Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web. But at its heart is an Elizabethan who perfectly personifies the British tradition of the lone, determined genius tinkering in the garage to create something truly unique.
As a child, I was fascinated by mathematics and also by almost any object, whether it was a piece of cloth or a mechanical device. I have felt a compulsion to understand how it worked.
Clive Sinclair was a child prodigy. By the time he was 10, his school told his father they could teach him no further mathematics. Maths and electronics were his twin passions, but he chose not to go to university. Instead, after a brief stint on a hobbyist magazine, he set up his own company, Sinclair Radionics, and he had two driving beliefs: make it cheap and make it tiny.
Sinclair first caught the market's eye when he miniaturized big calculators by making the silicon chip function on a minute amount of power. The result was the world's first pocket calculator.
The pocket calculator made Sinclair his first fortune. Soon after, he turned his miniaturization obsession to something even more everyday: the television.
This is claimed to be the world's first truly commercial pocket television. It's being launched by an English company in London today, in America later this week.
These inventions brought Clive Sinclair fame and wealth, and then in 1979 he turned his attention to the emerging trend that would utterly transform all our lives.
With Queen's Awards for both technology and export already to his credit, he and his team set about launching the world's first compact personal computer.
By the late 1970s, advances in silicon chip technology had transformed computing, and Clive Sinclair saw an opportunity. Why, he asked, should computers be so big and so expensive? And he set himself and his team the task of producing a compact, cheaper home computer. And the result was this: the Sinclair ZX80.
ZX80 is a complete computer, selling for just under £100. It plugs straight into a conventional television. You can learn to program on it and subsequently use it, perhaps in your job or at work.
For huge numbers of people, the ZX80 did bring computing into the home. It might have been rudimentary, it might have taken hours to complete the most basic tasks. But for many of us, this was our first glimpse of the looming computer revolution. The Sinclair ZX80 was hugely successful, outselling all similar American and Japanese production combined.
20,000 units have already been sold, and 50% of production goes for export, mainly to the United States.
It's now the world's best-selling computer. We're selling over 10,000 a month.
The Sinclair ZX80 was followed by the ZX81 and then the Sinclair Spectrum, a slightly more expensive model that brought colour, sound and a wealth of games into children's bedrooms up and down the country.
Within a year, Clive launched his Spectrum. It was a huge success. In 9 months, 200,000 had been sold. In 1983, Sinclair Research made a profit of nearly £14 million.
Clive Sinclair's moment of computer glory burned brightly, and then it burned straight out, because just as with the Comet, Jet, or the hovercraft, British innovation was overtaken by foreign competitors who reaped the business benefits. Because being first means not getting everything right. And with his invention of the C5 electric vehicle, Clive Sinclair quickly became a national laughingstock. And yet, in electronics, he left behind a real legacy. He built a platform. He created an environment in which huge numbers of geeks and gamers continue to flourish to this day. Today, the world's best-selling computer games, from Grand Theft Auto to Tomb Raider, have a proud British tradition. Games now account for more than half of the UK's entire entertainment market, earning more than the music and film industries combined. Clive Sinclair had a talent for seeing the future, and he wasn't alone. At the same time he was developing his first home computers, another Elizabethan was revolutionising a very different kind of industry. Hers was an entirely new way of approaching business, and it would kickstart one of the most significant trends of the second Elizabethan age. On the 26th of March, 1976, a brand new shop opened in this bohemian lane in Brighton. Founded with a bank loan of just £4,000, it had a minimalist aesthetic. Even its distinctive dark green paintwork had been chosen to hide damp patches on the walls. It sold a hippie-ish range of natural creams and lotions in unmarked plastic bottles. Nobody thought it would last very long, not even here, but it did have a rather good name.
We opened up next to a funeral parlour, and they sent me a solicitor's letter saying you can't do this because the coffins used to pass twice a day. Next week, we had it in our local newspaper, Body Shop, and of course, we were flooded with guys thinking it was Brighton's first sex shop.
Like a sound you hear that lingers in your ear, but you can't forget from sundown to sunset.
Anita Roddick grew up in Littlehampton on the south coast, the daughter of Italian immigrants. A free-spirited child of the 1960s, she spent her 20s drifting around Europe, the Pacific and California. But by the mid-70s, she was back in the UK, married with 2 small children. And when her husband, Gordon, announced a long-held ambition to ride across South America on horseback, she decided to open a small shop selling beauty products.
It's alive for, you know, anybody, I think, who's got 2 young kids and whose husband is transporting himself across South America, riding a horse, to say, you know, what I want to do is open up 10, 15, 20 shops to be a force for social change. What you want to do is make £300 a week to survive, so the kids could eat and have enough money to put into the van.
But the Body Shop took off beyond Anita Roddick's wildest dreams, and increasingly she was a force for social change. Anita Roddick was so far ahead of the curve, she was almost out of sight. She believed in all natural ingredients, sustainably and environmentally sourced. She was against animal testing. She believed in recycling passionately. She was green. Now, today, these ideas are pretty much mainstream, but in the context of the business world of the 1970s, they were regarded as borderline nutty. This is a classic case of someone dismissed as out there until, right at the last minute, the world says, obviously, Anita, yes, right all along. Within 2 years, the Body Shop was growing so fast it started franchising the business to open more outlets across the UK and then across Europe and globally. In 1984, with 93 shops around the world, the business was floated on the stock exchange.
A beauty business founded 8 years ago on just £4,000 was launched on the stock exchange this morning, and now it's worth millions.
Roddick used the Body Shop as a platform to promote and publicise causes she felt strongly about. From Greenpeace to global warming, animal rights to the destruction of the rainforests.
I was very much a child of the 60s and very politically active. And that, during the 80s, has transferred itself from political activism to social activism with a huge dollop of concern for the environment.
Anita Roddick's philosophy was about embracing influences and ideas from around the world. She introduced us to the concept of ethical consumerism, and then she turned that into a global brand. As the second Elizabethan age progressed, we became better and better at operating within a globalized society, reimagining our historic connections with the empire and the wider world. And one woman turned this into an art form. This may look like the elaborate, futuristic set of a Ridley Scott sci-fi film, but it's not. It's a showroom for bathroom appliances in West London, and it sprung fully formed from the brain of one of the most ingenious, inventive, and celebrated architects in the world. A woman who challenged the very notion of what a building could be, and who then exported her ideas all around the globe.
People always ask me, what does it feel like to be a woman architect? And I always say, I really don't know, because I've never been a male architect. At the same time, it's very difficult for people to deal with you because you're not part of that fixed idea what an architect should be.
Zaha Hadid grew up in Baghdad in Iraq, the child of liberal professional parents.
It was an amazing place. Great people, very open society. Fun. I think maybe by 11 years old, I was already want to become an architect.
She came to London in the 1970s, aged 22, to study architecture. Soon after, she took British citizenship.
The whole atmosphere was about rebellion, and challenging the kind of status quo. Nobody wanted to be normal.
But nobody was quite prepared for just how unnormal Zaha Hadid's visions were.
She refused the brief of the mundane and designed imaginary monuments to an architecture which didn't yet exist.
After years of winning plaudits for her designs, in the 1990s she was finally able to show the world her uncompromising style in all its beauty. And to each of her buildings she brought a very specific aesthetic. One that drew on her Iraqi heritage.
I know there's a tremendous influence of geometry. And the Arab world, mathematics and algebra and geometry is very part of kind of our culture.
Lots of old British industries had depended on the empire with its cheap raw materials and captive export markets. And so, when the empire vanished, that was a body blow to much traditional British manufacturing. And yet, we never lost our thirst for the shapes, the tastes, and the colours of those other parts of the world. We brought them home, and we reimagined them, and we twisted them, and then we sold them on. We were using those ancient imperial connections in new ways. Hadid rejected perpendicular angles in favour of sweeping lines and angular, jagged forms. Her buildings defied spatial and architectural logic. And she quickly became dubbed the Queen of the Curve. It wasn't until 2006 that Britain got her first permanent Zaha structures, and of those early buildings, this is one of the most impressive. It's on the banks of the River Clyde. It's Glasgow's Riverside Museum, which opened in 2011. But I would argue it is as important symbolically as it is structurally, because it's just down the water from the site of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders, which Jimmy Reed tried so hard to save. Could there be a better symbol of the transition during the Queen's reign from the old industrial economy to the new service sector? Once we forged and riveted great steel ships to plough the world's oceans, and now, thanks in this case to an Iraqi woman, we sell design, ideas, and culture. Zaha Hadid created an entirely new vision of how we build. In so doing, she helped put Elizabethan Britain at the forefront of international architectural design. But it would be another new Elizabethan who would turn a flair for design into a truly global British brand. One night in 1978, a 31-year-old engineer crept through the eerie silence of a closed sawmill outside Bath. He was a man possessed of a restless, inventive mind, and a very specific problem was currently occupying it. The sawmill, he felt sure, held the answer. That man was James Dyson, and the problem occupying his mind was to do with suction. He'd been told that sawmills used a process called cyclonic separation to gather up the sawdust. He was intrigued, and so he grabbed his notebook and pencil and stole into the sawyard to sketch the cyclone. And if ever James Dyson can be said to have had a eureka moment, this was surely it. James Dyson was, at that stage, an inventor and engineer most famous for designing the ball barrow, a wheelbarrow with a ball instead of a wheel. But that night, he hit upon a brand new way of manufacturing vacuum cleaners.
It's the first change since the vacuum cleaner was introduced in 1901. We've got rid of the bag and the filter with a cyclone. The problem with a paper bag is that the dust and dirt has to be collected by the bag and the air has to pass through the bag. But of course, the first thing that the dust does is go and gravitate straight towards the little holes and block them.
Having sketched the sawmill cyclone, Dyson spent months replicating the effect of dual cyclone separation on a much smaller scale by building more than 5,000 prototypes. But existing manufacturers didn't want to know. Instead, Dyson was forced to produce it himself. It would be 5 years after that nighttime excursion to the sawmill that Dyson's first vacuum cleaner hit the market. And almost 20 before they began to dominate, the British brand that conquered the world.
Dyson
Dyson will this week announce they'll be selling £30 million worth of vacuum cleaners to Japan in the next 12 months.
The British vacuum cleaner industry and the British electrical industry, this is a first in technology, and we can go out and show the world that the British can make wonderful technology.
In many ways, James Dyson is in the Christopher Cockerell and Clive Sinclair tradition of the great British inventor, the lone genius slogging away in the garden shed or the garage, or in Dyson's case, the old coach house by his Bath home. But here's the difference. Whereas Cockerell and Sinclair were never able to fully capitalise on the value of their inventions, Dyson's steely commercial focus has allowed him to build a big global brand. Dyson would become one of the great success stories of British engineering, a global company now with its headquarters in Singapore that measures its turnover in billions. From vacuum cleaners, Dyson moved on to hair dryers, hand dryers, fans, washing machines, a whole range of appliances. For his contribution to British industry, he received a knighthood.
Sir James Dyson for services to business.
James Dyson isn't, of course, the only new Elizabethan industrialist to be honoured at Buckingham Palace. From manufacturing through to industry, the monarchy has made its priorities clear by rewarding again and again industrialists, inventors, engineers and artists. And when it comes to cultural exports, of course, the Queen's own involvement has been a little more direct. From tourism to feature films like The King's Speech and blockbuster series like The Crown, our history and our monarchy have been used to market Britain around the world during the Second Elizabethan Age. Now, with Elizabeth II, Britain's longest reigning monarch, it seems a good time to reflect on that legacy and the transformation we have all experienced over the last 7 decades. The Queen's reign has seen revolutionary change in the British economy, the crashing down of an old industrial order and the society and politics which supported it, while at the same time there's been a largely unpredicted and unexpected growth of a new economy based on fresh technologies, finance, new ideas and culture. And throughout that transition, our Queen has remained a constant, symbolising the idea of Britain abroad, both our traditions and our future.